You're listening to The Scary Collector. Tonight, we don't deal in fiction. We don't traffic in invented monsters or dreamed-up shadows. What you are about to hear is real. Every story in this collection has been drawn from documented sources. Police reports, survivor testimonies, court records, and first-hand accounts that were never meant to become something this terrifying. These are 5 true horror stories. Not the kind that fade when you turn on the lights. The kind that follow you. We ask only one thing of you before we begin. Find somewhere comfortable. Somewhere you feel safe. Because by the time we're done, you may not feel that way anymore. Story 1. Begins now. Story 1. The Watcher. In June of 2014, Derek and Maria Broaddus purchased a large, 6-bedroom Victorian home at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey. They paid $1.3 million for it. They brought their 3 children to see it for the first time. They stood on the lawn. They looked up at the wide porch, the gabled roof, the tall windows that looked almost like eyes. They were happy. They were so happy. The house had been in the Woods family for decades. It was a stately home, well-maintained, the kind of place that whispered old money and long summers and children riding bikes down wide suburban streets. The previous owners left behind a letter, not unusual for a home sale. This letter was different. The letter was addressed to the new owners. It began, "My dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard." And from the very first line, something was wrong. The letter was signed, The Watcher. Let me read you portions of what that letter said. Because no summary does it justice. Because the words themselves, even now, more than a decade later, carry something cold inside them. Do you know the history of the house you have just bought? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why do you think the Woodses wanted to leave so quickly after 23 years? I am pleased to know your name and the name of the young blood you have brought to me at 657 Boulevard. Young blood. The letter went on. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. I have been waiting for the right family. 657 Boulevard is anxious for you to move in. It has been waiting and is so very hungry. Hungry. Derek Broaddus, upon reading this, immediately called the police. The previous owners were contacted. And here's where it gets darker, because it turns out the Woods family had received a letter from the Watcher as well. They had received it shortly before the sale was finalized. And they had said nothing. They had hidden it. They had completed the transaction and walked away from a house they had lived in for over 20 years and said nothing to the people buying it. They had fled. The Westfield Police Department opened an investigation. But there was almost nothing to go on. The letter was postmarked locally, but there were no fingerprints. No DNA. No witnesses. And then another letter came. I asked the house the same question as I ask you now. Have you found what is in the walls yet? In time you will. I am in charge of 657 Boulevard. I have already found a way in. The family never moved in. They couldn't. Maria described lying awake at night imagining what might be watching from the trees. Derek described driving past the house and feeling the windows staring back at him. Their children, who had been so excited, who had pressed their noses against the glass of that front door and pointed at the rooms they wanted, stopped asking about the new house entirely. The Broaddus family filed a lawsuit against the previous owners for withholding knowledge of the letters. They tried to sell the house. No one wanted it. They tried to demolish it and subdivide the property. The town council blocked it. They rented it for a time. Tenants reported feeling watched through the windows. One family moved out after only a few weeks. A third letter arrived. This one warned that the young blood needed to come to the house, that the children were meant to be there, that the Watcher had been patient but was growing restless. The police investigated multiple suspects over the years. A neighbor was looked at, then cleared. A mentally ill local man was considered. No charges were ever filed. The identity of the watcher has never been officially confirmed. The Broaddus family eventually sold the house at a significant loss in 2019. 5 years of terror, of sleeplessness, of a dream home that became a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. 5 years of wondering. Who is standing in the street at night, looking up at those windows? One detail from the case has never left me since I first encountered this story. In the third and final letter, the watcher wrote, "Once I know your names, I will call to you, and the young blood will respond. 657 Boulevard needs you." The house sold to new owners. They live there now. No letters have been reported since. But ask yourself, and I mean this sincerely, would you know if someone had been watching your house for 3 generations? Would you know if someone had chosen you before you ever chose them? The Watcher case remains one of the most disturbing documented stalking cases in American suburban history. Not because of violence, not because of blood, but because of the patience, the intimacy, the sense that whatever this person was, they had been waiting a very, very long time, and they were not done. Story 2. The Box Beneath the Bed. Content warning. This story contains descriptions of prolonged captivity, psychological abuse, and control. Listener discretion is advised. On May 19, 1977, a 20-year-old woman named Colleen accepted a ride from a couple she had met at a birthday party in California. She was hitchhiking, not unusual for the era, trying to get from Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's birthday party in Westwood, California. The couple seemed friendly. They had a baby with them. In the logic of that time, you didn't fear a man traveling with his wife and infant child. The man's name was Cameron Hooker. The woman was Janice. About an hour into the drive, Cameron pulled the car to the side of the road and told Colleen he needed to put something on her head. He described it as a safety device. He said it was required for her to ride with them. Colleen, confused and uncertain, agreed. He placed a wooden box over her head. It was a device he had built himself, a rigid wooden contraption that fit over the skull like a helmet, blocking light, muffling sound, disorienting the wearer completely. Inside the box, in the dark and the silence, Colleen began a journey that would last 7 years. 7 years. The Hookers lived in Red Bluff, California. They had a basement, and beneath their bed, Cameron built a wooden box, a coffin-shaped container, approximately 3 feet wide and barely large enough for a human being to lie flat. Colleen was kept in this box for up to 23 hours a day. She was brought out to do housework, to be controlled, to exist on whatever terms Cameron decided. What followed is one of the most thoroughly documented cases of psychological manipulation and captivity in American criminal history. Cameron Hooker used a combination of physical restraint, sleep deprivation, isolation, and an invented organization he called the Company, which he claimed was a vast, shadowy group that monitored slaves and their masters and would kill Colleen's family if she ever tried to escape. She believed him. This is the part of Colleen Stan's story that people struggle with most. She was not physically chained to a wall. She went on runs. She got a job. She visited her family, her actual family, while living as a captive. And she said nothing. She told no one. For 7 years, Colleen Stan's family believed she was simply living with a young couple in Northern California, being a nanny, getting on with her life. Psychologists who later studied the case used it as a foundational example of coercive control, what was then beginning to be called the Stockholm Syndrome and what we now understand as a complex web of traumatic bonding, manufactured dependency, and the absolute destruction of a person's sense of self through sustained psychological warfare. Cameron told Colleen she was special, that she had been chosen. He built elaborate rituals around her captivity that gave it meaning, made it feel ordained. He used intermittent reinforcement, moments of apparent kindness followed by punishment, to keep her psychologically destabilized. He isolated her from every potential source of rescue. And crucially, he made her believe that escape was death. Not just hers, but her family's. In 1984, 7 years after she was taken, Colleen Stan left the hookers. She left not because she was rescued, not because police intervened. She left because Janice Hooker, Cameron's wife, had grown disillusioned. Janice told Colleen the truth. The company didn't exist. There was no organization. There were no watchers. It had all been invented by Cameron to keep her compliant. Colleen Stan walked out of that house and into a life she had to almost entirely relearn. Cameron Hooker was arrested in 1984. He was tried in 1984 and 1985. He was convicted of kidnapping and multiple counts of rape. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. He has been denied parole multiple times. He remains incarcerated. Colleen Stan eventually married. She has spoken publicly about her experience. She has said, and this is the thing that I think most haunts people who encounter her story, that she doesn't consider herself a victim in the traditional sense. She considers herself a survivor. She has described the years since her release as a long, slow excavation of who she actually was before Cameron Hooker decided who she would be. What makes this story horror, in the truest sense of the word, is not the box. The box is terrible. But the box is a physical thing. What Cameron Hooker built inside Colleen's mind was far more imprisoning than any wooden container. He built walls she couldn't see. He built a cage made of her own thoughts. And that is the kind of horror that no lock can keep out, because it was never about locks at all. Colleen Stan was 20 years old when she got into that car. When she finally left the house, she was 27. The world had moved on without her, and she had to find a way to move with it. She did. Somehow she did. But we should never stop asking. How many people, right now, are living in boxes we cannot see? Story 3, Cabin 28. There are crimes that get solved. There are crimes that go cold. And then there is Cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort in Plumas County, California. A crime so savage, so strange, and so thoroughly surrounded by failure that it has haunted investigators, families, and true crime researchers for over 4 decades. April 11, 1981. Easter Sunday. Sheila Sharp, 14 years old, had spent the night at a friend's cabin at the Keddie Resort, a small, struggling vacation community tucked into the Sierra Nevada mountains. When she returned to Cabin 28 the next morning, she found the door unlocked. She found her mother, Sue Sharp, dead on the living room floor. She found her mother's friend, Dana Wingate, also dead. She found her brother, John Sharp, dead. All 3 had been bound with medical tape and electrical cord. All 3 had been beaten with extreme force and stabbed multiple times. Sheila's younger siblings, Ricky, Greg, and Tina, were still in the cabin. Ricky and Greg were alive. Tina was gone. Tina Sharp was 12 years old. Her body was not found with the others. Investigators found evidence that she had been present during the attack. Blood, physical evidence, but she was not in the cabin. It was as if she had simply been taken. Tina's skull was discovered 3 years later, in 1984, approximately 40 miles away in Butte County. Other remains were found in the following years. She had been murdered, but who took her, why she was removed from the cabin, and what happened to her in those 3 years between, none of it was ever fully established. The investigation into the Keddie murders is a case study in catastrophic failure. The crime scene was not properly preserved. Evidence was mishandled. Early suspects, including men who had been seen around the resort that night. Men with prior records of violence were not pursued aggressively enough. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed. There were rumors of interference. There were rumors of cover-ups. None of this has ever been conclusively proven, but the sheer number of failures is staggering. Let me tell you what we do know about that night. Sue Sharp was a mother of 5 who had recently separated from her husband and moved to Keddie Resort as an affordable place to restart her life. She was described by everyone who knew her as warm, protective, devoted to her children. The resort, while declining, was a tight-knit community. She knew her neighbors. On the night of April 11th, there was a gathering of some kind at Cabin 28. Multiple people were in and out of the property in the hours before the murders. Investigators developed a theory over the years, and in 2016, a Plumas County Sheriff's detective named Mike Gamberg announced a significant development. A former Plumas County resident named Martin Smart had been identified as the primary suspect. Smart had lived nearby in 1981. He had a history of violence. His then-wife had told investigators that he had confessed to being involved. Martin Smart died in 2000. A second suspect, John Bo Bubaid, died in 1988. Neither was ever charged. Sheila Sharp, who discovered the bodies, has spent her adult life seeking answers. She has given interviews. She has met with detectives. She has watched the case stall and restart and stall again. In one interview, she described returning to Plumas County to visit her mother's grave and said that every time she does, she drives past the road that leads to Cabin 28. She said she can't look at it. She said she wonders what they saw at the end. Her mother, her brother, Dana. She wonders if they were afraid. The Keddie Resort closed in the years following the murders. The cabins have fallen into ruin. Cabin 28 itself was demolished in 2004. But the land is still there. And the people who lived through that Easter morning, Sheila, Ricky, Greg, are still alive, still waiting for answers that the justice system has never provided them. For people are known to have killed or participated in the killing that night, according to various investigators' theories. None was ever charged. None faced a courtroom. If any remained alive to today, they would be in their 60s or 70s, living ordinary lives, perhaps surrounded by grandchildren, perhaps thinking about that night in the mountains when something inside them broke loose and killed 3 people and took a 12-year-old girl. Cabin 28 no longer exists. The crime does. Story 4. The Murder Castle. We travel back now. Back to a different era. To 1893. To Chicago, Illinois. A city transformed, polished, illuminated for the occasion of the World's Columbian Exposition. The World's Fair. 65,000 exhibits. 27 million visitors over 6 months. A city trying to prove something to the world, to show itself gleaming and modern and magnificent. And in the shadows of that gleaming city, a man named Herman Webster Mudgett, who called himself Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, was building something of his own. Holmes was, by every account, extraordinarily charming, handsome, a trained physician, a man who could sell you anything and make you feel grateful for the privilege of buying it. He had a quality that people who later studied him struggled to name precisely, a warmth that wasn't warm, an interest in you that felt somehow like hunger. He began construction on his building at the corner of 63rd Street and Wallace Avenue in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago in 1887. He told different contractors different things about what he was building, replacing them frequently so that no single person would ever understand the full structure. What emerged was a 3-story building with a pharmacy on the ground floor and a hotel above. Designed specifically, it would later be revealed as a place from which no guest could easily leave. The building contained over 100 rooms. Many had no windows. Several were lined with iron plates. Some could be sealed from the outside and filled with gas. Holmes had run gas pipes to multiple guest rooms that could be controlled from a panel in his bedroom. There were trapdoors and chutes leading to the basement. The basement contained a kiln that burned at temperatures sufficient to incinerate a human body. There were pits of acid. There was a dissection table. Holmes used the hotel to accommodate visitors to the World's Fair, primarily young women, many of whom had come to Chicago alone seeking employment or a new life in the city. He was captivating. He made them feel seen. He offered them rooms, jobs, his attention. And then he killed them. The precise number of Holmes's victims is unknown and has been debated by historians for over a century. Holmes himself claimed to have killed 27 people. Some researchers put the number closer to 9. Others, studying the building's design and the number of missing persons connected to Holmes, suggest the true number could be much higher. He was not caught through good detective work or witness testimony. Holmes was caught because of insurance fraud. In 1894, after the World's Fair had closed and the castle had been largely abandoned, he was arrested in connection with a scheme involving horses and fraudulent life insurance policies. While investigators examined his background, the full scope of his activities began to emerge. The building was investigated in 1895. What authorities found defied their ability to process it. The gas lines, the airtight rooms, the chutes to the basement, the kiln, the pits, evidence of bodies, partial remains, bones, the physical proof of what the building had been used for. The press called it the Murder Castle. The name has stuck. Holmes was tried for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel, an associate he had killed as part of an insurance scheme. He was convicted. He was hanged on May 7, 1896. He was 34 years old. In the months before his execution, Holmes wrote a memoir in which he described himself as physically changing, becoming monstrous, inhuman. He described his face as increasingly taking on the aspect of a devil. Most historians regard this as self-serving theater from a man who had spent his whole life performing. But the description has lingered. The idea that somewhere, between the charm and the crimes, something had emerged that could recognize itself for what it was. What makes Holmes so persistently terrifying? Why his story has endured for 130 years? Why entire books and television series and documentaries have been made about him? Is not just the crimes. It's the architecture of them, the patience, the planning. He didn't build the castle after he decided to kill. He built the castle first. He designed murder into the walls before the first victim ever checked in. He looked at a building and saw a mechanism. He looked at people and saw opportunities. The murder castle burned down in 1895 under mysterious circumstances. The land it stood on is now a United States post office. Chicago has never fully reckoned with what it hosted in 1893. A city full of light and wonder and new invention, and somewhere beneath all of it, a man who had built a structure specifically designed so that the people who entered it could never find the way out. The World's Fair Pro. Mice the future. Holmes had a different kind of future in mind. Story 5. The Caller. Our final story is the one that I have returned to more times than any other on this list. Not because it is the most violent. Not because it involves the largest number of victims. But because of the phone calls. Because of what the voice said. Dorothy Jane Scott was a 32-year-old single mother living in Anaheim, California. By every account, she was a devoted parent to her 4-year-old son, Sean. She worked. She was quiet. She was, in the language of tragedy, an ordinary person, which is to say, a person whose life had value that cannot be measured, whose absence left a hole that has never been filled. On the night of May 28, 1980, Dorothy was at work at an upholstery company with 2 co-workers when one of them, Conrad Bostron, collapsed. He had been bitten by a spider, and his arm had swollen severely. Dorothy drove Conrad to the UCI Medical Center in Orange, California, accompanied by another coworker, Pam Head. At the hospital, while Conrad was treated, Dorothy told her coworkers she was going to get the car and pull it around front. She walked out into the parking lot. She was never seen alive again. Pam and Conrad waited. Dorothy didn't come back. They searched the parking lot. They found Dorothy's car. It had been moved. Surveillance footage from the hospital, such as it was in 1980, showed Dorothy's vehicle speeding out of the parking lot at high speed. Witnesses reported seeing a woman screaming inside the car as it left. Someone had been waiting for her. Waiting in the parking lot. Waiting in the dark. 4 years later, in August of 1984, skeletal remains were found in the city of Anaheim. They were identified as Dorothy Jane Scott. Forensic examination suggested she had been killed. The exact nature of her death was impossible to determine from the remains, but investigators had long believed foul play. But here is the detail that elevates this case from tragedy to something that operates on a different frequency entirely. Something that, once you know it, you cannot unknow. After Dorothy's disappearance, her parents, Jacob and Vera Scott, began receiving phone calls. A man's voice, calling regularly, speaking about Dorothy in ways that only someone who had been there could know. The calls continued for years. The man on the phone described Dorothy, described things about the night she disappeared. In some calls, he was taunting. In others, he seemed to want to confess, to describe what he had done without quite doing it. In one call, he told Vera Scott, "I have your daughter." He said, "She's in a place where you'll never find her." He said, "And this is the detail I cannot let go of. She cried for a long time. But she doesn't anymore." The calls continued even after Dorothy's remains were found. Even after she was buried. He kept calling. For nearly a decade, this man called the Scotts, called Vera, called Jacob, and talked about what he had done. He was never identified. He was never caught. He stopped calling sometime in the late 1980s, and no one knows why. He may have died. He may have simply stopped. He may, right now, be an elderly man in Southern California who knows exactly what happened in that parking lot and has lived with that knowledge for 45 years. There are things in this case that don't add up in ways investigators never fully resolved. Who was he? How did he know Dorothy was going to be at that hospital that night? Because the spider bite was sudden, unplanned, unscheduled? The most chilling possibility is that it wasn't planned. That he saw her. That he followed her. That he acted on impulse, and it was simply the terrible intersection of her ordinary act of kindness, driving a sick coworker to the hospital, and his presence in that place at that moment. A coincidence that became a catastrophe. Sean, Dorothy's son, was 4 years old when his mother walked into a parking lot and didn't come back. He grew up without her. He has spoken about her in interviews over the years, about growing up with her absence as a constant companion, about his grandparents' phone ringing and knowing, sometimes, who it might be on the other end, about a man's voice in the middle of the night, talking about his mother like she was still somewhere he could reach. Dorothy Jane Scott deserved better. She deserved to raise her son. She deserved to grow old. She deserved the ordinary, beautiful, unmemorable life that was taken from her in a parking lot in May of 1980. Her killer deserved justice. He never received it. The case remains officially unsolved. It is classified as a homicide. It sits in a file somewhere in California with all the other names, all the other women who walked into the dark and didn't come back. The caller never gave his name. He gave them nothing except the knowledge that Dorothy had been afraid, and then she hadn't been anymore. And that, in the end, is the most disturbing kind of horror. Not the monster under the bed. Not the thing in the dark. But the voice on the other end of the line, patient, calm, possess. Of a terrible knowledge, telling you what it did, and hanging up. 5 stories. 5 real events. 5 reminders that the world we move through every day, the houses we buy, the cars we ride in, the hospitals we rush to at midnight, the mountains we think are peaceful, can hold things we never anticipated. The watcher believed a house was owed its occupants. Cameron Hooker believed a human being could be owned. The person who killed in cabin 28 believed they would never be found. Holmes believed that architecture could be designed for death. And the caller believed his knowledge gave him power over a grieving family, over and over, year after year. What all of these stories share is a belief, on the part of the people who perpetrated them, that they could reach into someone else's life and reshape it entirely. That they had that right. That the world was theirs to arrange. They were wrong, but not before they caused immeasurable harm. We tell these stories at the Scary Collector not to frighten you for the sake of fright. We tell them because the victims in these cases, Sue Sharp, Sheila and her siblings, Colleen Stan, the guests of Holmes, Dorothy Jane Scott and her son Sean, deserve to be remembered, because knowing what happened is the first step toward understanding how it happened, and understanding how it happened is the only way we ever get any closer to making sure it doesn't happen again. That doesn't make the darkness less dark, but it means the darkness has a witness, and sometimes that's enough. This has been the Scary Collector. If this collection kept you company tonight, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Leave a comment. Tell me which story affected you most. Share this with someone brave enough to listen. And until next time, sleep well, if you can.